11,000 containers 20 feet long. And it takes 2 weeks. So essentially, the adjustment is infinitesimal. And as we know from thermodynamics, near equilibrium slow adjustments are benign. They're linear. None of the interesting stuff happens. But what does happen, so think of this as kind of a weather map of these pressure differentials. There we go. What does happen, if you then take the hole between those two chambers and make it bigger, 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 at a certain point, what was a trickle becomes chaotic. It becomes chaotic because the gradient is so steep that you end up generating these self-organizing systems that Prigogine and other guys talk about. We think of it as chaos, but I think protectionism is that. I think that's one form of chaos. I think political disputes in America, I think class war, to tax the rich or whatever, those are turbulence. I think terrorism is turbulence. All those things we don't like. We don't like it because our brains prefer non-turbulent situations because you don't die very often in those situations. So once you hook the world up with optical fiber, two things happen. First, the ships move at the speed of light and they have an infinite number of containers. And so what was a gradual adjustment now is a collapsing situation. The second thing that happens is that as the capital markets develop, is that the hurdle or threshold, you can think of it as transactions costs in economics or goal points in international trade. But basically, there's a certain amount of energy you have to have in order to get over the hump to make anything happen. Boltzmann wrote that down as the Boltzmann distribution, Boltzmann probability. It's the probability two things will crash into each other with enough energy to make something happen. And in there is a little term called activation energy, which we would think of as the transactions cost. And basically, in a world before optical fiber, the activation energy was quite high. And as optical fiber happens, the markets develop, information flows speed up, and the cost of transactions decline to almost zero. Boltzmann's number gets to be very, very small. And in all of science, basically, every time you shrink that thing, if you shrink that, you double the speed of reaction. There's a thing called Arrhenius behavior that measures that using Boltzmann's distribution. So essentially, you take a world with faster information flows and big gradients, and then you say, what do you think will happen? That's where our friends Prigogine and the like come in. Spent a long time looking at how, actually, studying whale oil between two pieces of glass with a fire underneath it and seeing how the rotating hexagons form and patterns form in the whale oil. That's where that all started. But basically, dissipative systems of any kind arise when you get far enough away from equilibrium. And accelerating change, whether it's trade, capital, human capital, growth, or whatever, triggers this turbulence problem. Now, turbulence has been studied a lot. Not with much result, but it's been studied a lot. We all think of a fluid moving by an obstacle in a river. It's just kind of going around, right? Doesn't work like that, really. It does in the textbook. It's called laminar flow. And in order to get laminar flow, you have to assume zero viscosity. It's like the perfect gas. But this guy Reynolds in the Royal Society did experiments where he pushed colored fluid through the middle of a tube of clear fluid, and then he went faster, 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 faster. And what he discovered is at a certain point, it blew up, but he put a strobe light behind it, and it looked like this. Now, that thing, every artist would know, is a Kalman vortex street. That's what Hiroshige drew when he drew tide pools. But Kalman vortex streets are what you see spinning off the end of airplane wings when they take off. If they never left the wing, the plane could never get off the ground because there's an energy requirement. But it's these patterns that are the really interesting thing. In the real world, with viscosity, something like this happens, where you get a turbulent zone behind a region of change of a size that varies with force. I took this off of the Canadian Plumbers Association lobby group. It's really there. And what it says is, if you push something through a pipe, and you push it faster, and you force it to change direction, at a certain point, turbulence ensues, and turbulence eats the system. Turbulence corrodes the material and destroys the system. So we could pursue this topic at any level of conversation, but I maintain that the accelerating information flows and the turbulence that ensue have generated tremendous systems in conflict. I'm sure Republicans and Democrats doesn't capture it anymore. There's a group of people that felt like they were abandoned by the changing global economy and became very angry about it and have political power. And there's another group that, because the story I'm describing is one that says, oh, let's move all the capital in the world to a different place. There are moving men in the world. We call them investment bankers. Their job is to move capital. And in this story, they're going to make a lot of money because there's a lot of moving going on. And so you've got Goldman Sachs over here and the construction worker, the factory worker in Louisville, Kentucky. They hate each other. Although the hatred is mostly one directional. But this turbulence happens from acceleration and from change of direction. And I think in terms of like a shame on us thing, a lot of times, I'd raise my hand to say, who's the free market guy? Spend my whole life doing that. But I think sometimes we oversell and we don't acknowledge that the change in the flows that happen in an environment where that's like we described can make casualties. And those casualties have lives and power and they get mad. And so later on we'll talk about China, but basically China is full of people who have been damaged by the tremendous change that we describe as a 1,000% increase in GDP. But there's corruption, there's farmers kicked off their land, there's stolen land, there's bad water, there's bad air, and last year there were more than 80,000 disturbances, many of them with people killed by policemen. And so turbulence is expensive, is the moral of that story. So non-equilibrium thermodynamics basically says when you're away from equilibrium, you run into all these interesting situations, which if you go to the bookstore, you'll find books under these kinds of titles. Okay. One of them that's interesting is the kind of work done under the name mathematical network theory, which is sort of a carry-on from what would have been graph theory long ago. How to get across the bridge in St. Petersburg from Euler. But basically, a property of networks is that all networks fail. They don't all fail all the time. Some of them fail more than others. How often they fail and how deep the failure is, the conclusion of this new growing body of network theory, is it depends on the architecture of the network. It depends on how many nodes are connected to how many other nodes, and whether there are super nodes. In the internet, the super node would be MSN or Google or somebody who's connected to everybody, basically. And there's a body of research that shows that more times than you might think, the distribution of those networks falls into patterns that are quite similar, and they're described with power laws. Power laws are essentially the first derivative of the Boltzmann probability. And so there's something tying all this stuff together. And I believe that it's the nature of the system failures that happen when you accelerate change in a steep gradient thermodynamic network. So what does that mean? That means markets fail. In particular, credit crunches happen. The IMF has a database now that has identified 124 credit failures, or banking system failures, since 1970. Right? 2/3 of the members of the IMF and the World Bank are in that database as having had system failures. And in my experience, I've lived through 4 big ones as an investor in the U.S., you know, the SNL failure, the .com failure, the one we just had, and others.